Well, it gives me great pleasure to introduce this session and to introduce two old friends. Patrick FLORES is the first, and he's the Professor of Art Studies and Director of the Vargas Museum at the University of the Philippines, Quezon City in Manila. And we seem to have been in touch over quite a long period at various conferences and mutual contribution of essays and so forth. I do encourage you to try and read some of Patrick's work because it's written in a very interesting style, halfway between a philosopher and a car repairer. And I don't know whether my brain has been repaired properly or not when I finished his text, but I feel that certain kinds of intellectual errors have disappeared after he's done it. And Patrick is not only an art historian, but as I said, a curator, and also very vigorously a curator of contemporary art. And the only other thing I should mention is that he's just edited, and it's about to appear from the Japan Foundation, an anthology of writings on Southeast Asian art. So please watch out for that with Yoshida Kamiya. Kamiya is the editor. So please welcome Patrick FLORES from the Philippines.
So thank you, Jen, for the introduction, and thank you at TFAM and Spring Foundation, and to Eating and Washing for this invitation and the hospitality. I am pleased to be here. In responding to the concerns of this conference, I turned to the archives of the Vargas Museum, where I work as a curator. The Vargas opened in 1987. In the museum's desire to activate the archive in relation to the permanent art collection and the contemporary art program, it had conceptualized the parasite exhibition titled Track Changes, in which materials from the archive would be gathered in uniform vitrines and inserted into the exhibition space. It is part of the effort of the museum to offer another layer of discourse besides the collection and the contemporary. The contemporary is another form of intervention in what I envision as the curator as interpenetrating planes of materials in a space that has been freed from the obsession of the white cube and soaks up the external landscape, the natural light, and the rest of the rooms of the building that is thankfully mostly glass and aluminum. The first of this series of initiations focused on the materials of the museum donor Jorge Vargas, the sculptor Guillermo Tolentino, and the poet, collector, and political operative Aurelio Alvero, to trace a nativist strain in Philippine modernism in the first half of the 20th century, which was the time of the American occupation of the Philippines. Here, the role of the archive is marked as contemporaneous with the collection and current art, and then situated in the larger project of art history. In the same vein, art history is located in the more extensive reflection on a possible theory of the modern in the context of the museum that historicizes its material and it inscribes itself in the ecology of contemporary sensible life. By nativist, I provisionally mean the range of articulations that may be considered not yet or never to become colonial, and therefore potentially national or nationalist, or perhaps the basis of the exemplary folklore that is the nation. What I'm going to present to you in this conference is a proposition in support of a theory of the Philippine modern through the thought and practice of Vargas, Tolentino, and Alvero. They are constellated as a way to elaborate on their investments in the project of shaping the aesthetic of the distinct and sovereign Filipino by making, collecting, curating, and annotating art, all of which are but cognate modalities of distinction and autonomy akin to the state of fantasy that is the nation. Vargas collected Tolentino, and Alvero helped Vargas build his collection. Furthermore, the archives of Tolentino are in the University of the Philippines, which administers the Vargas collection. and of which Jorge Vargas used to be a student of its first law class and later a regent. Relating Tolentino and Alvero to Vargas is particularly intriguing as it gives us a glimpse into the aesthetic and political implications of making art, making nationalisms, and making museums. The constellation of the figures Vargas, Alvero, and Tolentino demonstrates the first moment, carving out a corpus of initiations that has sought to produce a collection and a collective. The second moment pertains to the relationship between expressions of the Filipino across three registers: the native, the national, and the non-objective. In this sequence of categories, the notion of the modern is rendered complicated, subjecting it to the interpellations of an ethnic, racial, and civilizational conception of a category nominated as Filipino. The latter rubric is then disciplined by the national and then let loose in another atmosphere called the non-objective. The theoretical problem I see in this constellative gesture is the way the modern might overdetermine or colonize the problem of self-consciousness. And so I ask, is there another way to reflect on this condition beyond the province of the modern? Let me now begin with Jorge Vargas. In the archives of Vargas are two important texts in which he explicates notions of the Filipino peasant and the role of the University of the Philippines, the university established by the colonial American government in 1908. In the philosophy of the Filipino peasant, Vargas denies his subject any form of agency, portraying the peasant as all at the same time, indigent, indolent, and nearly inert. In the mind of a landowner like Vargas, the peasant, who is distinguished from the town worker, is a creature of Spanish colonial history and can only be redeemed by the enlightenment of American culture. In this gesture, Vargas attempts to offer both an ethnographic description and a historical analysis of the peasant, beyond which he stages an argument for the modernity of the Filipino under the auspices of the Americans. He concludes that the Spanish regime has forestalled ambition and has left the peasant, quote, nothing more than a sort of vegetating human animal, end of quote. On America's watch, and I quote him again, the philosophy of the Filipino peasant will be the philosophy of an awakened, enlightened nation, according to Vargas. It is also to America that Vargas speaks when he writes, What is the University of the Philippines?, written 2 years after the Americans opened the university in Manila. In this essay, he imagines the institution as a milieu that gathers a polyethnic archipelago at the instance of a colonial regime, one that has to inevitably cohere into a nation-state to be governed exclusively by Filipinos. This agenda of Filipinization was for him the linchpin of the university, the crucible to hone a, quote, self-governing people of a, quote, homogeneous nation that brings about a, quote, self-dependent national existence. The imagination for the collective may well have formed Vargas's premise for an art collection. His founding documents would yield references to cultural heritage as vital for a young republic and the logic of art as a kind of accumulation, in his words, that serves as a gauge of a level of culture. Important texts in the archive of Guillermo Tolentino tend to pursue this trope of the Filipino formation. Tolentino, however, probes a deeper stratum to reference an ancient ethnic and racial continuity beyond the strictly colonial and imperialist civilization. In The Language and Script of Tagalog, 1937, he begins by laying out an almost encyclopedic account of the Philippines through the different systems of knowledge, describing flora, fauna, and people in lofty and idiosyncratic Tagalog, an ethno-linguistic marker of a community organized around the capital of Manila. The language is the basis of the consolidated national language, which is Filipino. This is the context of his discussion of the Philippine language and script. It opens with an epigraph referencing Mahatma Gandhi, who asserts that if any language can become India's national language, and someone must become India's national language if Indians are to become a nation, that language is Hindi. The book offers a homage to the Tagalog poet Francisco Baltasar, or Balagtas, by foregrounding the organization called Balagtasiana, which you see on the far right, that declares itself to be, quote, never to be dedicated to a place, state, sect, and faith, an invocation of the universal by way of negation. Tolentino illustrated some pages as well, including the one imagining how the Tower of Babel might have looked like from a planetary perspective, and in the context of the birth of Tagalog as one of the world's languages. In Rizal, published in 1950, so this is one of the pages in that book, no? Comparing Tagalog to Japanese, Chinese, and Hebrew. In Rizal, he writes a biography of the national hero. At the end of the book is a story of Rizal's sister Trinidad Sayan's episode with Tolentino, who deciphers the patriot's message. Here we are led to weave the strand of the paranormal or the occult, the animate image and the animist belief with the rationality and artifice of the national. It also reminds us of what David Tay calls the preternational, that is a field defined in relation to nation, yet not reducible to its terms or its logic, thus constantly haunting its hegemonic stature. The labor of Tolentino to foreground ethnological knowledge may be part of a broader design to form a Filipino matrix of national independence and creative freedom. This takes shape aesthetically as far as Tolentino's practice is concerned in the drawing Grupo de Filipinos Ilustres, which Tolentino did in 1911 and was transferred onto lithographic stone by the artist Jorge Pineda in 1912, pulled in sepia, and had the first edition of 1,500 copies. It is an imaginary of a Filipino national vanguard, a contrived composite portrait of figures from different time frames and political persuasions, abstracted to simulate a coming together for the Filipino nation, set against an enlightened landscape and classical ornamentation. According to the Philippine scholar Resil Mujares, the work may be linked up with the 1908 law on the construction of the Pantheon of Illustrious Filipinos. He adds that this came at the time of the formalization of national identity through symbolic production from art, scholarship, monument making, and the standardization of the Tagalog orthography. Such a visual construction of Tolentino's Illustrious Filipinos, Mujares adds, is, quote, male, heavily Tagalog, Creole, and Chinese mestizo in descent, and metropolitan in character, and not to mention mainly in Western suits. Megan Thomas further widens the frame of this discussion by identifying the fixation on the ancient as an obsession of Orientalist scholarship that was based on ancient text, which was made the index of authenticity and the defense against civilizational decline. The Philippines, however, presented a different scenario, as no watershed could be cited and hence no decay could be marked, simply because, and I quote her, the deep pasts of their people were textless, thought to be among those without history. This is the impulse of the overinvestment in language by the elite and amateur scholar in the Philippines, which generated the desire for a unifying language anchored in Tagalog, for this, quote, polyglot, modernizing, and increasingly cosmopolitan archipelago. Tolentino participated in the scholarly discourse that brought together the ethnological and the folkloric, the systematic and the everyday, the better for a self-consciousness of history and pretensions to nationality could take deeper root. Elaborating on this aesthetic of the national are the monuments of Tolentino. These are condensations of the local in a classical romantic visual language of heroism and history. The sculpture Filipinas in Bandage and the Oblation pursue this tradition of visualizing the Philippine condition allegorically in the grammar of classical statuary. Firstly, Tolentino thought of antiquity as modern. Secondly, he evolved a language of monument making from the strictly academic, as in his work on Filipino heroes, to a, like this one, the Bonifacio Monument, and the Rizal monuments, no? To a neoclassical approach that quotes Philippine folk life. The Commonwealth Triumphal Arch, which was never done, on your left, which was originally conceived by the alumni of the University of the Philippines, of which Jorge Vargas was the president, is a case in point. In Tolentino's own explanation of the design, the various figures would support the arch in the manner of transporting a nipa house from a temporary location by means of bayanihan, the native way of mutual cooperation. On opposite basis, the whole Filipino people, Christians and non-Christians alike from all religions of the archipelago. So these figures, in the same manner mentioned above, transport their semi-independent government from its shaky or sandy location to a permanent solid foundation of the Republic of the Philippines. End of quote. Aside from the reference to the bayanihan, Tolentino also claims the arch as reminiscent of the native singkaban, or festival arch. It is at this moment when the folk meshes with the classical that we discern Tolentino's inclination to mix and to abstract, which leads me to the third figure of this paper, Aurelio Alvero. Alvero, who opened his collection to the public in 1942. He was born to intellectuals. His father was the painter Emilio Alvero, and his mother was Rosa Sevilla, the founder of the Instituto de Mujeres, the first Filipino-run lay Catholic school for women. He was an accomplished orator and took up law and education simultaneously. He was a poet, publishing his first book of poems, Moon Shadows on the Water, at the age of 21. He taught English, history, and the Tagalog language. He was tried as a Japanese collaborator and was imprisoned from 1945 to 47 and from 1950 to 1952. He co-founded the Young Philippines, a French nationalist party of the 1930s, advocating the political salvation of the world, that the political salvation of the world lies in dictatorship rather than democracy. The other founder was Wenceslao Vinsons, who in 1932 in Manila delivered a speech titled Malaysia Irredenta. Alvero founded as well a quasi-fascist blue-shirted organization which was modeled on groups in Germany, Italy, and Spain. He went by the name Magtanggol Asa, which in local language meant defending hope, and wrote prodigiously on Philippine culture. In one monograph, he recounts how the Asa Museum began as a collection and reproductions he bought in 1930. In 1933, he acquired a house for himself and his 10 real paintings. In 1944, the collection grew to a total of 550 paintings. In 1955, he sought to restore it with 350 paintings alongside sculptures, stamps, coins, ceramics, and ethnological artifacts. Alvero helped the foremost wartime collector in Manila, Jorge Vargas, who was a political figure in the successive imperialisms of the United States and Japan. Both Alvero and Vargas supported the Japanese imperial government when it occupied the Philippines from 1942 to 1945, specifically in the effort to tilt modernism towards an Oriental or Asian aesthetic, which intersected with Gauguin's exoticist visual vocabulary. A case deserving closer study is the first exhibition of so these are some of the works of Aurelio Alvero from the archives of the Vargas Museum. This poetry in English, But a case deserving closer study is the exhibition of non-objective art in Tagala in 1953 in Manila. Here, the idiom of Western abstraction, which is written by Alvero. Here, the idiom of Western abstraction would be realigned twice, first through the term non-objective and second through Tagala, a reference to the dominant ethnic society in the country that is appropriated presumably as an alternative to the colonial name of the archipelago, which is the Philippines. Like Guillermo Tolentino, Alvero was an avid promoter of Tagalog culture, as evidenced in the books that he wrote and published. The said non-objective art exhibition held in 1953 consisted of 28 paintings from 11 artists. According to the release in the newspapers at the time, the non-objective is a plastic statement of the artist's subjective feeling, emotion, attitude, and/or reaction to objective stimuli. What matters is not external reality anymore, but its transformation into a new kind of reality in terms of shapes and lines and colors interacting in space. It approaches the quality and condition of music in the sense that musical ideas are expressed with musical means. And once so expressed, musical statements or compositions are not wholly translatable into the other art forms. End of quote. It is not very clear who curated this exhibition, but there is very good reason to believe that it was Alvero who organized it at the Philippine Art Gallery. First, Tagala is a peculiar term that had figured in Alvero's earlier work, such as Art in Tagala, a catalog of his collection of Philippine art published in 1942 and 44, where he annotated both the life of the artist and the quality of the artistic corpus. Second, Alvero wrote a monograph on the exhibition. This monograph is the most extensive documentation of the project and one that explicates the basis of the non-objective as a category of analysis in art history and art criticism in the Philippines. Recent research, however, from the archives has revealed that the title of the exhibition was the first non-objective art exhibition in the Philippines, and that Alvero changed Philippines into Tagala in the monograph, as you can see. So this is the ephemeral material from the archive, but that's the monograph of, the one on the left is the monograph of Alvero. Alvero would foreground the non-objective as a kind of linear movement away from realism and the culmination of the struggle for subjectivity as opposed to objectivity, of which, according to him, photography was emblematic. This departure from objectivity was coincident with the art historical trajectory premised on the modern, a critique of the academic style and a series of transformations through Western-derived styles of Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, and the School of Paris. Surely much nuance is elided in this art historical rendering of the story of modernism. That said, the drift towards non-objectivity proceeds from this history. Alvero contends that the non-objective moment in the West found its watershed in the works of Vasily Kandinsky, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, Jackson Pollock, Robert Motherwell, Isamu Noguchi, Natsuki Takehita, and Piet Mondrian. In the Philippines, he would identify Hernando R. Ocampo. Well, this is a text that he wrote for a magazine. No? These paintings are non-objective, explaining what non-objective is to a more popular audience. And this is, he thought of Hernando Ocampo as one of the earliest exponents of non-objective art. And here we can see the transformation of the work of H.R. Ocampo from post-impressionism on the first slide to a School of Paris style of some kind of cubistic style on the second, and then non-objective on the third. According to him, non-objective painting consists of things that existed in the mind's eye, irrespective of the actual physical or visual nature of the objects. The artist, he continues, did away with the depicting of the external and went into the internal and eliminated cognizable representation. The term objective, non-objective, was harnessed by Baroness Hilary Bay, painter and polemicist who was advisor to Solomon Guggenheim and was instrumental in building up the collection of the Guggenheim Museum. Rebay curated the first exhibition of the Museum of Non-Objective Painting, the precursor of the Guggenheim, that was titled Art of Tomorrow in 1939. Rebay, in mobilizing the term non-objective, was said to have been shaped in part by her studies in theosophy and Vasily Kandinsky's writings, among other influences. She would also compare non-objective painting to music. These paintings are harmonious, beautiful, and restful, according to Rebay. They elevate into the cosmic beyond, where there is no meaning, no intellect, no explanation, but something infinitely greater, the wealth of spiritual intelligence and beauty. End of quote. In Alvero's interpretation of non-objective, the notion of plasticity is central. Alvero, in fact, quotes the American abstractionist Hans Hofmann as an epigraph to his monograph. According to Hofmann, a plastic idea must be expressed with plastic means, just as a musical idea is expressed with musical means, or a verbal idea with verbal means. Neither music nor literature are wholly translatable into other art forms. And so a plastic art cannot be created through a superimposed literary meaning, end of quote. What is important to call out here is a modernism that moved away from post-impressionism to abstraction and to informal, with a certain inclination to music as a condition to be aspired. Second, non-objectivity might have conversed with Ribet's interest in spirituality and by extension addressed the search for mysticism. And in this regard, well, this is the Museum of Non-Objective Painting as curated by Hilaire Ribet. So this search for mysticism. So in this regard, Guillermo Tolentino's practice, this is the sculptor, as a spiritist who conducted seance sessions may well be relevant. He presided over the Union of Christian Spiritists of the Philippines, which was affiliated with the World Spiritist Foundation. In one essay on the organization, he counts as part of the motley coterie of spiritists the likes of Moses, Plato, Buddha, Christ, Kant, and Edison. He describes the mediums who compose the organization as doing the impossible. When in trance, they can heal the sick locally and telepathically, arrest the spread of epidemics. Still others operate without any surgical equipment, but their bare hands, end of quote. In this effort to, and this is, just some of the archival material that shows the work of Tolentino in the field of spiritism and also in the Filipino script, Tagalog script. In this effort to, and so let me conclude. In this effort to discuss Vargas, Tolentino, and Alvero, I tried to propose a theoretical framework of the Philippine modern that considers the aesthetic, artifactual, and discursive implications of the archival material. I did this mainly to revisit the constitution of the collective, the ethic of collecting as embodied by Vargas, and the process of a national formation in relation to the emergence of a post-colonial republic imagined by America, the possibility of an Oriental nation envisioned by Japan, and the desire for Philippine independence crafted by the tropes or signifiers of civilization, racial particularity, and the national spirit. These tropes or signifiers tend to harden, even coarsen, and typify into culture, but are at the same time get loosened up or released into some kind of mystical atmosphere, dissipated in the cosmos of the non-objective that breaks up the coherence of the national, so that it can yield again the native or the antique and open up the international or the modern, recover some entitlement to the classical and romantic tradition of the heroic and the monumental, and finally inhabit the space of the worldly, the immaterial, and the afterlife. All this without being burdened by the empiricism and idealization of identity. What might be offered here as a method is to contemplate the modern, finally the post-colonial modern, in terms of scale and relay, a form of current that alternates and therefore can be successive without being progressive, or a reflexive range that is constantly calibrated, or a shifting scape of theaters, locales, or schemas that keep the modern always already emergent, like some kind of excited archive. Thank you.
And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Clare VEAL, who I should confess was my former PhD student, but now has distinguished herself in the field of Thai photography. And if you notice in the brochure, you'll see the Trans Asia Photography Review mentioned. This is very easily available on the web as tapreview.org. If you want to look at some of her very interesting writings. And I've also worked with Clare on two collections, but she's also, two exhibitions, I beg your pardon, but she's also distinguished herself recently by doing a survey of an important eccentric Thai artist called Chang Tse-tang, and is going to talk to you today about aspects of Thai photography.
Thank you, John, for the introduction. And I also want to give my thanks to the Spring Foundation and the Taipei Museum of Fine Arts for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to speak today. So photography in Thailand has had a historically tenuous relationship with discourses of fine art. The medium has always been excluded from the curriculum of the country's premier art school, Silapakon University, and it's not included within the National Exhibition of Art. Yet recent years have seen a veritable explosion of photography's presence. One of the country's best-known artists is the photographer Manit Siwanachapum. Annual photographic festivals are now held in Bangkok and Chiang Mai, and Bangkok boasts several commercial galleries dedicated to photography. Furthermore, the inaugural exhibitions of My Iam Museum, established in Chiang Mai in 2016, were retrospectives of works by Apichapong Weerasetakul and Kamin Lechai Prasert, both which featured their photographic works. Similarly, retrospectives of photographers practicing in the 1980s and 1990s, including Brahmawan Barusupat, were held recently at Bangkok's only public institution for contemporary art, the BACC. So this paper pursues the relevance of these transformations to the theorisation of both photography and contemporary art in the Thai context. To this end, the following discussion will proceed along two interrelated lines of inquiry. To begin simply, if we understand the contemporary as a historical moment, then photography's increasing viability as artistic practice can be attributed to relatively quantifiable transformations in networks of artistic legitimation that proliferated in the post-Cold War period. Here, photography functions to highlight shifts in imbricated institutional and professional networks. Yet a conceptualization of the contemporary as merely a series of institutional transformations is limited in the sense that it upholds a system of periodization in which the recognition of photography as art in Thailand and Southeast Asia more generally appears as a peripheral and belated inheritance. So the title of my paper, The Photographic Conditions of Contemporary Thai Art, points to a more demanding objective. In Rosalind Krause's 1981 essay, The Photographic Conditions of Surrealism, she describes the relationship between photography's indexical function and its position as the example par excellence of surrealist artistic practice. For Krause, the photographic became a way to reconcile the expansive range of artistic forms produced underneath the banner of surrealism. In a similar way, photography and its use by Thai artists promises a framework through which its contemporaneity may be apprehended. While this examination is premised on the reproductive conditions of photography, it's not my intention to advocate a formalist notion of medium specificity. In fact, such a position is particularly problematic given long-standing debates over photography's definitions and functions, issues that have become even more ambiguous with the advent of the digital. Instead, I want to examine the processes through which an idea of photography, or more specifically an ontology of the photographic, came to fulfill a desire for contemporaneity as manifested in curatorial strategy and artistic practice. So I use the term desire here in a critical sense as a way of indicating that Terry Smith's notion of the contemporary as, and I quote here, distinct temporalities of different ways of being in time is in fact only comprehensible through the work of the imagination. From this perspective, contemporaneity becomes a state of becoming, its perpetuity indicating the limit of its complete realization. So how might the relationship between contemporary art and photography in Thailand be formulated in relation to the medium's prehistories? A revealing way of addressing this question is through a discussion of photography's position vis-à-vis discourses of fine art. So the establishment of Thailand's first art school, Silapakon, by the Italian artists in Birasi in 1933, cemented distinctions between fine art and photography already entrenched in the Thai court's preference for academic oil painting, which was established during the reign of King Chulalongkorn between 1868 and 1910. Birasi based the school's curriculum on that of a European art academy, a model in which photography had no place. Indeed, Birasi understood photography as being directly opposed to the creativity of artistic practice, a position that was in accordance with his wider view of art as diametrically opposed to technology. So photographers who endeavoured to overcome the medium's artistic exclusion thus sought to efface the medium's technological nature and emphasise their own creative interventions. This was exemplified in the preference for pictorialism within the Royal Photographic Society of Thailand, or the RPST, which was established in 1951. Enigmatic techniques adopted from European photography were also European surrealist photography, were also popularised by this group as another means of intervening into the photograph's reality effect. For the most part, prior to the 1980s, photography's recognition as art was achieved via endogenous networks of legitimisation. Of key importance to this endeavour was the development of the association between the RPST and officially sanctioned notions of national identity. Such associations were emphasised by the organisation's receipt of royal patronage in 1958 and the explicit encouragement of nationalist subject matter in themes for its annual exhibitions. Yet at the same time, the RPST photographers could increase their prestige within endogenous networks by evidencing that their work could garner international praise and support. For example, in exhibition catalogues, members would often list recognitions by overseas photographic clubs and organisations, including the International Federation of Photographic Art, or FIAP. So it is evident from this brief history that by the 1980s, the mobilisation of exogenous networks in order to circumvent endogenous limitations on artistic photography was not an unprecedented phenomenon. However, in this later period, institutional transformations, including increased access to overseas education, a proliferation of international and regional exhibition opportunities, as well as a privileging of certain types of photographic practice within these exhibitory circuits, increased opportunities for exogenous legitimisation. The first of these transformations, that within the educational sphere, concerns a group of students who studied overseas, primarily in America in the 1970s. For many of these individuals, including Iti Kongkakun, who completed his PhD at Illinois State University in 1979, and Brahmawan Barusapat, who completed his MFA at Texas State University in the same year, An overseas education was facilitated by US scholarship programs initiated during the Cold War. For both Brahmuan and Iti, studying in the US resulted in the establishment of their photographic practice, as educational opportunities for the medium were largely absent in Thailand. So upon returning to Thailand in 1980, Brahmuan took up a position at Sri Nakarin Wirot University, where he taught the photographer Manit Siwanachapum. In 1983, Iti and Brahmuan became founding members of the Faculty of Applied Arts at Chulalongkorn University, where Brahmuan developed a curriculum for artistic photography based on his experience in the US. This course proved invaluable to local photographers unable to study overseas because it exposed them to avant-garde photographic techniques and produced a sphere of legitimization beyond that offered by the RPST. However, due to a lack of exhibition and work opportunities for graduates, very few became professional artistic photographers. Nevertheless, both Iti and Brahmuan had a substantial role in expanding the range of exhibition opportunities for artistic photography in Thailand. This included their curation of the Thai photography section as part of the ASEAN exhibitions of painting and photography, which were initiated in 1981. As Brahmuan stated in his essay for the exhibition's third iteration, The first ASEAN exhibition of painting and photography marked for the first time any real interest in the topic of photography as art in Thailand. However, the effect of these opportunities on the status of artistic photography was uneven. While Bramuan later stated that the opportunity to meet other photographers from Southeast Asia had an impact on his perception of artistic photography, Manit Siwanitchapum argued that his participation had a limited impact because the exhibition as a form of cultural diplomacy tended to reinforce national borders. So while the ASEAN exhibitions included pictorialist photographs by a number of well-known members of the RPST, they also included photographs that diverged both aesthetically and conceptually from these works. Iti, for example, took pains to differentiate his photographs from works produced by RPST members by locating their beauty in their conceptual richness as opposed to their subject matter, something that was apparent in the increasingly abstract nature of his works. Similarly, Bramuan's writings on artistic photography emphasised the importance of an individualistic approach to creative practice, which was manifested in his works with this kind of preoccupation with explorations of the self. This new type of artistic photography, epitomised by Iti and Bramuan's work, came to be recognised under the term creative photography, or in Thai, Pap Thai Sang San. In 1984, the Bangkok Pictorialist Circle, together with an independent committee, which included Iti as its vice president, organised a competition for works that adopted this photographic style. The terminology used in the essays included in the competition's exhibition catalogue provide a picture of how this new form of artistic photography was conceptualised. Specifically, several authors emphasised that creative photography should be understood in terms of its strangeness, or kwam black, its newness, kwam mai, and its originality, kwam kit rit. Interestingly, in the Cambodian context, the Khmer words for strange and new have been similarly used to describe performance art in order to distinguish it from other types of performance. So as Roger Nelson has argued, the use of these terms indicates that it's not foreignness that attracts the artist to performance, but rather the form's newness and strangeness. A similar situation is found in Thailand, where creative photography premised a type of cosmopolitanism where a specific approach to media was formulated as a type of privileged access to the new and the strange. In this sense, the positioning of Bramuan's work within a wider field of conceptualist art practice in Thailand appears logical, despite the artist's assertions to the contrary. So according to Apinam Poshianon, conceptualism in Thailand developed as a tendency among a group of artists returning from overseas in the early 1980s, including Chumpon Apisuk and Gamon Pausawat. The use of media associated with conceptualism, including installation and performance, was therefore often attributed to foreign influences, despite some attempts to argue for the indigeneity of such artistic forms. While not entering into debates over the Southeast Asianness of installation and performance, one may still point to a non-Euro-American lineage within which these practices might be situated. In Thailand, this includes the display of billboards created by the Artists Front of Thailand along Ratchadamnern Avenue in 1974, the experimental 1960s theatre group Crescent Moon, with whom Chumpon Apisuk was associated, as well as the practice of the Sino-Thai artist Jang Tang, who John mentioned earlier, whose gestural paintings influenced his students' interest in time-based and experimental creative processes. In this sense, it's perhaps more productive to think of the term strange as a means of opposing Thai patronage systems' preference for works that reflected a conservative nationalist ideology based on the three pillars of nation, religion, and monarchy. Given this confluence between visual production and nationalism, discourses understood as existing outside this system would often include exogenous styles and approaches while not being limited to them. For example, when Bramuan stated that photography's political potential rests in its universal appeal, this may have been a way of asserting a position that was opposed to the RPST's narrow nationalistic interests, rather than an indication that his work should be understood in terms of their foreign influences. Similarly, speaking of his time studying in the United States, Bramuan also spoke of the freedom afforded by working in the democratic medium of photography in what he perceived to be a less oppressive political context. So this gesture towards the international as opposed to the foreign meant that the distinction between self and other was not necessarily a matter of identification for these artists, but rather one's potential way, existing among several others, to operate outside endogenous artistic restrictions. In this sense, the strangeness of the exogenous was used to address situations specific to Thai art worlds. As such, the rise of conceptual art may also be linked to the establishment of the Birasi Institute in 1974, a not-for-profit gallery without a permanent collection. The financial instability of this institute encouraged transient event-based exhibitions as a means of collecting revenue from audiences, and also led to the employment of several artist curators, including Jumpon Apisuk, who curated the Weti Samai exhibition series in 1986-7, and the Folk Thai Time exhibition, which included works by Bramuan, shown here. These exhibitions provided photography with artistic legitimacy by situating it as part of a broader field of conceptual practice. Not only did photographic works feature autonomously among the performances, music, art and writing exhibited as part of these shows, it was often also included as part of these installation and performance works as a mixed media element and as a form of documentation, as in Gamon's work here. The inclusion of strange and new artistic forms in both the creative photography competition and the Birasi exhibitions led to criticisms from members of mainstream artistic institutions, including Silapakon and the RPST. Specifically, critics argued that the exhibited works demonstrated a lack of taste and craftsmanship and labelled the use of new media forms foreign fashions. This, combined with the closure of the Birasi Institute in 1989, cemented the lack of exhibition opportunities and patronage support for photography in Thailand, a situation that led to the departure of both Bramuan and Iti from the country in the 1990s. Bramuan and Iti's failure to find local patrons for their creative photography may be productively compared with the latest success of artist photographers such as Manitsi Wanachapum as a means of highlighting transformations in networks of artistic legitimation from the 1990s onwards. So both of these groups of artists exhibited overseas, yet Iti and Bramuan's participation in exhibitions in the United States and Italy were not sufficient enough to affect their ability to sell works in Thailand. By way of contrast, Manit's participation in international biennales has significantly improved his recognition within Thailand. For example, prior to participating in the 24th Biennial de Sao Paulo and the first Fukuoka Asian Art Triennale in 1998, Manit's work was situated as part of the lineage of experimental and conceptual practice that I've previously described, with his participation in alternative exhibitions, including the Hawaii Kwang Mega Project in 1996. From 2000, however, his participation in group and solo exhibitions at prominent private galleries in Thailand increased radically, and his works were purchased by a number of Thai collectors, including Disapon Chansiri and Eric Booth, as well as regional institutions, including the Singapore Art Museum and the National Gallery of Singapore. The key difference between these two groups of photographers is found in their approaches to the question of identity and the way this was framed in international exhibition contexts. Given Iti and Bramuan's efforts to find alternative visual discourses to that advocated by the RPST and Silapakon, The question of identity in any collective sense was not given much purchase in their works, and with the exception of the ASEAN exhibitions, their Thai nationality was decoupled from their participation in international exhibitions. By way of contrast, Manit's work embodies what David Tay has called the ironic critique of nationalism that came to dominate Thai art of the 1990s. For example, in Manit's Pink Man on Tour, you see this presentation of stereotypical images of Thai touristic kitsch together with the presence of the vulgar figure of Pink Man using a digitally enhanced colour palette. The extreme flattening that such aesthetic devices produced was intended to critique the facile and superficial commercialisation of Thai culture for the foreign gaze. However, the presentation of this series in international biennales represented paradoxically a re-exoticization of the artist himself as a privileged representative of his national culture of origin, something that became even clearer in the wide-held presumption that the artist himself was Pink Man when this was not the case. So Manit's example indicates the reification of a national-international dichotomy, which often collapsed the critical distance required to appreciate the irony of his critiques of nationalism. While international audiences might appreciate the artist's socio-political position, this could also contribute to a reaffirmation of the distinction between self and other, formulated as the politically developed and undeveloped. To this extent, photography was eminently suitable to the requirements of the biennial model, its ontology intersecting with the desire for the contemporaneity in several ways. In particular, photography's documentary legacy historically aligned with the ethnographic approach that seemed to dominate both artistic production from Southeast Asia and curatorial strategies for dealing with it. Yet this formulation of the relationship between ethnographic, curatorial and artistic approaches with photography is more than simply a historical hangover. Rather, if we understand the desire for contemporaneity as an appeal to move from extreme isolation to total proximity, and to do so instantly, constantly, for eternity, then the ontological conditions of photography are convergent with this desire. As Walter Benjamin recognised, photography's revelatory potential lays in its ability to make new worlds visible beyond the limits of natural human sight, or what he termed the ability to visualise the optical unconscious. It is this impossible conjunction of transience and fixity, or the space of a single minute in which space becomes time and time space, that aligns photography with the desire for contemporaneity. Specifically, the simultaneous compression of both space and time into a still image allows one to apprehend difference whilst maintaining the distance required to formulate it as other. This is precisely the function of photography that was drawn upon in colonial contexts in order to typicalise individuals as representations of particular ethnographic categorisations. So this relationship between the desire for contemporaneity and the photographic was manifested in an increasing prominence of what Nora Taylor has termed performances for the camera from the 1980s onwards. In these cases, photographic documentation allowed artists to incorporate the poetics of place and locatedness into performance works. This was found particularly in references to the rural via the location of craft in agrarian landscapes, as in Chalud Nim Summers' performance work, Rural Environmental Sculpture, and later in Wasinburi Supanit Warapat's UPO series. At the same time, exhibiting photographs of performances contextualised in relation to place could maintain the tension between absolute proximity and difference required by the biennial model. For example, in this recent example, a presentation of Maitri Siribun's Dreams of Beyond as part of the Lockroot Public Art Program during the 2016 Singapore Biennale, the markers of the Thai's Isan, or his northeastern Thai identity, are inscribed through the presence of the white buffalo and the pau kauma, or the cloth that's around his waist. Yet these conspicuous signs of otherness are catapulted into the space of the audience through a synchronicity between the hay upon which the buffalo lays and the natural landscape in which the image is displayed. Although photography's ability to reformulate time and space played an important role in the realisation of conceptual practices in Southeast Asia in the 1980s and 90s, photographs didn't replace the physical movement of artists undertaking performance or installation works in person. In this sense, one's presence at a prestigious contemporary art world event might confirm participation within exogenous networks of legitimization, but in order for this mobility to be converted into wider cultural capital, it must be documented. Again, in this respect, the photographic plays an important role. At times, the documentation is relatively straightforward, as in the case of photographs of temporary installations and performances. But as the 2011 photographic exhibition Once in Venice indicates, documentation can also become an artwork in and of itself. In many of these photographs included in the exhibition, we find series of representations nested within other representations. For example, in a photograph taken by Bricha Tao Tong, the artist in Venice number 2, the artist Tawong Go Udomwit is shown passing in front of his photograph Utilitarianism, which also features him as its subject. The image presents a reuniting of the artist and his work in the context of Venice Biennale, a moment that is then captured and transformed into an artwork for display to audiences in Thailand. The visual confusion created between the artwork that appears to spill over its frame and the artist himself produces a porous boundary between these representative levels, presenting a kind of co-temporality between the presentation of the work at national and international levels. This results in an idealized circulatory logic whereby the local and the global intersect with one another whilst maintaining their binary distinctions. We see this also in another set of photographs by Hasapot Mahamek, which show the photographer Dao Wasaksiri documenting the travels of artists, including Manit Siwanichapum and Tawan Dachani. These works emphasize the act of documentation, with Dao, the photographer, appearing in colour and the rest of the scene in black and white, immediately giving primacy to the viewer in Thailand, who may be substituted for Dao himself. So this mythologization of an unfettered relay between national and the global is also found in Nawin Rawan Chakun's Fly Me to Another World, a series of exhibitions between 1999 and 2006. This exhibition and its catalogue documented a semi-fictionalised story of the Thai artist In Son Wong Sam's travels overseas on a scooter in the 1960s and 70s using photographs, news clippings and comics. Here, while In Son's travels are giving valence through comparison with Nawin's participation in international exhibitions, In Son's on the left and Nawin is on the right. The distinction between the national and the international or the global is never problematized. Despite Nawin's description of In Son's international achievements, the catalogue for the show ends with a letter confirming In Son's receipt of the title of National Artist in 1999, and the exhibition's subtitle, The Unforgettable Story of a Thai Artist Who Made His Dreams Come True, reaffirms In Son's national affiliations. While these techniques of reduplication appear to fulfill the desire for contemporaneity that maintains the primacy of nationalist affiliations, this photographic mode could also point to the limitations of that desire. If, as Simon Soon has argued, photographs of transient artistic events speak as documents without narrative, then the photograph's revelatory potential is limited by its very nature. Returning once again to the work of Nawin, the apprehension of such representative limits, as well as the impossibility of completely fulfilling the desire for contemporaneity, is achieved through the dissolution of the distinction between fiction and reality. This is clearly seen in Nguyen's use of comic books to unsettle any certainty that might be found in readings of photographic truth in the documentary dimensions of his works. The continuous displacement of any originary object is also heightened through a continuous reincorporation and refictionalization of previous works in later projects. In this case, photography assures its status as an art object, but one that is constantly displaced through documentations within documentations. A similar means of frustrating the desire for contemporaneity was also articulated in the exhibition Substance About Non-Substance, which was organised by Nguyen and the performance artist Gosit Juntaratip in 1995 at the Goethe Institute, Bangkok. Consisting entirely of photographic documentation from the artist's performances and installations, Gossit's work in particular demonstrated a preoccupation with the relationship between corporeality and image. For example, in Happy Birthday, July 24, 1994, which consisted of a performance work in which the artist recreated a photograph of himself and his girlfriend using his own blood applied to a canvas in the form of Ben-Day dots. The resultant image was then photographed and redisplayed as documentation for the Goethe Institute exhibition. This process of reduplication, in fact, mirrors the photographic process itself. The subject in his or her corporal state is transformed into an object with the potential for infinite future replications. As with Nguyen's work, this use of photography to produce a mise en abîme displaces the originary object, transforming the presencing function of photography, which is so vital to the desire for contemporaneity, into one of loss, a mourning for an object that is constantly displaced. At the same time, by mimicking photographic processes, Gosit also provides a way out of this bind. In his 2003 exhibition Kiss at the Academy of Visual Arts in Germany, the artist displayed images of iconic kisses, including his own kiss with the blow-up doll Lily Ovary, which was taken from a performance work he undertook in 1994 in which he married this blow-up doll. This image was exhibited together with recreations of iconic photographs by Robert Doisneau and Alfred Eisenstadt. These large-scale images were produced by downloading the photographs from Google, printing them and then redrawing them using a camera obscura before scanning the resultant images and then redrawing them again using Adobe Illustrator before finally printing them out as digital photographs. In addition, during the exhibition, audience members were invited to redraw the KISS images again, thereby adding another stage to this chain of reduplications. In expanding the photographic process to the point of redundancy in this way, Gosit allows the photograph to gain signification independently of its object. And following Craig Owens, this use of mise en abîme thus endows photographs with an apparatus for self-interpretation, their structure defined by the juxtaposition between two images of the same motif, gives rise to the commentary on the conditions of photography itself. So why might such a commentary be important when thinking about the relationship between photography and the desire for contemporaneity? Speaking about the ethnogeographic curatorial approach that has dominated the biennial model, Lee Weng Choi has argued, and I quote him here, "The impulse to map is overdetermined by many agendas, but one of them, to command a privileged view from above, is precisely about having the power to see it all and render distance and difference abstract. What is notable about the impulse to map in ethnogeographic terms is how it reveals a desire to control or contain cultural difference into categories. A way of countering such an abstraction of time and space, he argues, is to allow audiences cohabitational time with artists, curators, and other participants by making the processes, debates, and conversations through which the exhibition comes into existence public. A similar argument may be made about photography to the extent that photographs tend to hide the processes through which they are made, instead inviting a view that they are produced by their subjects. Following the logic of Lee's argument, by introducing into the photograph a narrative structure that reveals the processes of its creation, the desire for contemporaneity might finally be realised. Instead of positioning the artwork, or indeed the artist, as a means to apprehend difference through the technologies of proximity, this narrative allows for a view of the work as process, a process that refuses ossification. It is also the point at which we may return to the aims of the conceptual photographers in Thailand in the 1980s and their efforts to find a place for photography among critical art practice. Indeed, in a context in which photographs, no matter how obviously manipulated, are often viewed as seamless icons of their sacred subjects, a focus on the processes through which a photographic image comes into existence immediately opens up a space outside these conservative nationalist discourses. So by proposing photography as a condition of the desire for contemporaneity of Thai art, I have not aimed to dismiss the significance of other mediums or prioritise the photographic aspects of specific works. Rather, I've attempted to use photography and its transformations in Thailand over the past 40 years as a lens through which some of the incomprehensible and contradictory dimensions of the desire for contemporary may be apprehended. Photography is particularly productive to this endeavour because its radical transformation highlights distinctive changes in networks of legitimation that we may frame as a shift from the modern to the contemporary. More importantly, however, photography, when understood ontologically, allows one to brush up against the edge of the contemporary, its ability to visualise the optical unconscious appearing as a fulfilment of the desire for proximity and difference, while also pointing to the limitations of coevality. Thank you.
Hello, it's work now. You want to? I haven't got the. Yes, you might need your earphones for translations. Yeah. I just whilst they're getting their earphones for if questions are given in Chinese, they can translate. I'd really like to thank our two speakers for very, very interesting talks, particularly. As you can see, with historical collections which are in any sense modern, what's put in them is result of a whole series of choices which have political and historical contingencies. So the question of whether they're canonized or not is really a later question. The first question is what goes in the archive and how does it go in it? And for the purposes of this conference, at any rate. And then Clare has raised this very interesting issue. I hope everybody's realised how significant it is that people talk about archives as if they're objective, as if the material which goes into them is clear, the types of material that you put in, documents, papers, artworks functioning as documents functioning as artworks. But what we've seen today is very, very, very clear, and we must thank Clare for making it so clear that some artistic discourses, particularly those which rely on technology and they've been around for a long time, obviously, since the middle of the 19th century, like photography, actually are very suited to archiving. But they also raise the question of other issues to do with the archive, that some works are archivable. They're actually productive of archiving because they perform all these other kinds of functions, and she's outlined the issue of living in the contemporary. So that's a point we might want to bring out. What is an archivable work, and what kinds of questions about art and its relationship to other kinds of social process does that kind of archive produce? And that's clear from her work. May we have a question, please? Question over here, please. Are you putting your hand on your... Oh, you're just putting your hand... Sorry. I thought you asked. Question, please, somebody. This is a really central question. Please, Yusin. Sengiji. in the middle row.
Thank you both for your wonderful papers. This is a question for both Patrick and Claire. But coming from Claire, because you talked about strangeness or making strange as a kind of strategy, and I find that really fascinating. And to connect back to Patrick, and of course Ray Armando's essay, A Case for Hanging, talks about making strange through the exhibitions of the Cultural Center of the Philippines, precisely to make strange as well. So my question really is about strange, making strange, and I'm wondering, to make strange for whom? Is it for the national, local audiences, or is it for the international? Or is it for both as a way of problematizing the national and the international? This kind of strategy of making strange. Yeah, thank you.
I think in the case of the 1980s photographers I was talking about, making strange was a deliberate attempt to get away from those kind of nationalist work. So in that sense, they were addressing nationalist concerns by trying to get away from it. I don't really think they imagined their work as being strange for a foreign audience, because they really tried to uncouple their identity from the works. They didn't really want to be seen as Thai artists in an international context. I think in the case of Kosit and the later artists, it goes both ways, as you mentioned, because they are participating self-consciously in Biennale circuits where that issue of identity, even on the labels that are attached to their works, is always coming up for them.
Well, you mentioned Ray Albano. No? As curator at the Cultural Center of the Philippines, he was interested to present something new to the public. No? So he was, as part of a program called Developmental Art, no? Which coincided with the developments initiated by the government outside the center, like public works or the building of roads and so on and so forth. So on the one hand, he was trying to mimic the energy outside. So he was trying to present something new, different from the modernism that the Philippine art audience was used to. But at the same time, in doing that, in presenting something strange, he also invited people to revisit the familiar. So I don't lock this in a binary schema, that the strange and the familiar. I think it was part of a double coding of the new. That the new was strange, but it was also a kind of renewal. So for me, that's what happened at the Cultural Center of the Philippines, and what I do in the and I think in the case that I presented, I think that also obtained in how, for instance, Guillermo Tolentino would quote or cite the ancient to build a foundation for some kind of a Philippine classical tradition, which actually was never there, but and would be later appropriated by a national discourse. But it is interesting that Alvero would also go through that same procedure to make a case for the non-objective. So as I said at the end of the paper, that it's not really productive to confine these things in like sequential or binarist thinking. I'm reflecting on some kind of a relay or a series of things that can come together simultaneously or alternatingly. Yeah.
Lots one could say, but another question, please. On this question of archivable or archive-making types of work, this is a very important question, because all of us use archives, all of us, artists and art historians, use archives to look at the storage of works, but we have to realize that it isn't just a picture of whatever it is. It's actually a formation into which we insert or out of which we create meaning as we look at it. That's my proposition anyway. I don't see any hands up. Well, we got to the end of the day. We all... I think there's some fatigue in the audience. No more questions? Do I have a hand? No? Right. There's no more questions. Then we will bring this session to an end slightly early and rejoin at 3 o'clock, please.